In November 1963, 3 months before they first came to America, the Beatles played the Royal Variety performance in London in front of the Queen herself. Here's John Lennon addressing the audience.
Thank you. For our last number, I'd like to ask your help. Would the people in the cheaper seats clap your hands? And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewelry. Thank you. We'd like to sing a song called Twist and Shout.
95 days later, the Beatles landed in America on a Pan Am jet at the newly renamed JFK International Airport. And tomorrow marks 50 years since their arrival. And joining us to talk about this huge anniversary in Beatledom is local author and Beatles expert Robert Rodriguez. Robert, welcome back to Chicago Tonight. And as we were watching that clip, you correctly pointed out that was the Queen Mother.
Yes.
Not the Queen herself, but close enough.
Close enough.
All right. So Beatlemania had already hit in England, but not necessarily in America.
No.
What were the Beatles expecting when they came to the United States?
Well, that had been sort of the prize that they were aspiring to. It's like they were kind of cautious with the idea that nobody from Britain had really made it in America as a pop artist. You know,
Was that so?
Yeah, Cliff Richard had come and gone, didn't really make a stir the way they, had expected, and they, groomed him to be. And, Telstar by the Tornadoes had been a hit, but that was kind of a one-off novelty sort of thing. And they were sort of fearful of going to America and bombing. And as it happened, Paul McCartney was fond of telling years later that, oh, we didn't want to come to America till we had a #1 hit record. Well, it's not exactly the way it happened, because they were booked for the Ed Sullivan Show before they even had any hit record of any kind in America.
Well, part of their appeal was the cheekiness. I've heard it said they had this northern wit. I don't know what the cultural landscape is like in England, but evidently Northerners are known for their wit. Is that it?
Well, the Northerners, where Liverpool is, north of London, is considered sort of hick. It's like, you're not sophisticated like us down in London. So it's like, if anything comes out of there, it was like, oh, really? From Liverpool? Wow, what's from Liverpool?
Well, part of their appeal was their cheekiness, and they displayed it in one of their first press conferences, and let's take a look at their very first one.
Stance that the Beatles were able to take advantage of these opportunities that came their way. And they happened to be coming back from a tour of Sweden in October of 1963. Sweden being one of the first countries outside of England that really embraced the Beatles, and the whole screaming girl thing had been going on there. So they come back to Heathrow, and there's thousands of screaming girls to greet them upon their coming back. And Ed Sullivan happened to be there. He'd go to Europe periodically looking for new plate spinners for his show or whatever.
Plate spinners.
And he happens to see all these masses of people there, and he's like, what is this? Is the Queen coming through? What's all this about? And he was told it was the Beatles, this group, this musical group. And, he got to see what they look like. And he's thinking, that's cute. He didn't hear a note of their music, but the haircuts, these are funny looking guys. And it so happened that Brian Epstein, their manager, really had aspired to get them on Ed Sullivan's stage, recognizing that as like the premier talent showcase in America. So the two got a 1940s song by Vaughn Monroe originally, There I Said It Again. So it kind of gives you an idea of where this country was in terms of what was, selling by the millions at a time. Now, the Beach Boys were selling records.
What a sea change, though, from Bobby Vinton.
But yeah, the Beatles were totally fresh. I mean, nobody heard anything like that. And here they are bringing back, basically, American music to America.
Besides their television performances, they also did a few concerts during their visit at Carnegie Hall in Washington, D.C. And is it true that these concerts were also televised closed circuit to theaters across the country?
The D.C. one was, yes.
The D.C. one was.
Yeah, at the Coliseum there, it was basically a boxing venue where they were surrounded on all sides by the audience. And so the funny thing so when they had a little bit of a respite from the touring schedule and recording schedule in the fall of '63, George came to America. And there he jammed with a local band, and he sat in with a DJ, and he bought a Rickenbacker guitar on that trip. So, it was their first taste, a Beatles' first taste of America.
Well, another interesting side note, there was a 15-year-old girl named Marsha Albert in Washington, D.C., and she played a role in Beatles history. What was that role?
And a very critical, essential role. Now, mind you, the Beatles have put out 2 singles on local Chicago label VJ Records. Dick Biondi spun them in early 1963. Please Please Me. It was on the Silver Dollar Survey for a couple of weeks before it kind of faded away. From Me to You came out after that, didn't really do much. And then VJ passed on She Loves You, of all things. It was released in the Philadelphia label, Swan, partly owned by Dick Clark. So the fall of '63, they've got I Want to Hold Your Hand out, 1 million advance orders for it in England. That's how hot they are. And it was finally, when they were starting to get some good press and some attention, that Brian Epstein, after making the deal with Ed Sullivan, presses the issue with Capitol Records, who had the first rights of refusal, saying, you know, how much success do these guys need before you're going to pick up your option? So they're like, fine, we'll put out I Want to Hold Your Hand in mid-January 1964. Meanwhile, there was a television segment that aired the morning of November 22nd, 1963, the same day their second album dropped in England, and they were going to do an expanded version of that later that evening, but it was bumped from the day's news. They re-aired it on CBS with Walter Cronkite on December 10th. Now, Marcia Albert from Maryland, 15-year-old schoolgirl, was watching this. She writes a letter to her local DJ, a guy by the name of Carol James, saying, how come you guys don't play this stuff? This is great. Well, Carol James had seen the same broadcast. He's like, you know what, I'm going to act on this now that somebody's prompting me. So he had a friend that worked for BOAC, British Airways at the time, and brought an imported copy of I Want to Hold Your Hand, which did not exist in America at the time. And he spun it. He brought her down to the studio, December 17th this was. And he also made copies of it on tape for DJ friends in New York and Chicago. So now the toothpaste is out of the tube. The response is tremendous. Capitol Records, they're totally incensed by this. Say, cease and desist. You can't do that. That record can't even be bought yet. What are you doing? And they're like, sorry. You know, fan demand, can't stop it now. So they are forced to rush release it the day after Christmas 1963. Why is this critical? If they'd gone ahead and released it mid-January as they planned, there wouldn't have been that time of build-up but by the time the Beatles landed at JFK on February 7th. Instead, you've got this captive audience of school kids.
Whose appetite has been whetted by the early release of I Want to Hold Your Hand.
On winter break.
So everyone went. So when did they finally make it to Chicago?
They made it to Chicago on their second trip to America, which was August of 1964, where they played the amphitheater.
And how were they received here? Remind us.
Oh, rapturously. You know, by that time, you know, Ed Sullivan happened at the beginning of the year, and in between, A Hard Day's Night came out in theaters. So, I mean, they'd been stoking the fires of Beatlemania with their releases all year. You know, by the time, Will.
And what's going to happen there?
Well, I mean, every guest that they're going to have has got some connection with the Beatles, from Donovan to Peter Asher, who was the brother of Jane Asher, who Paul was dating in the 60s. He was also one half of Peter and Gordon. You know, there's going to be every author there, including Mark Lewison, who is like the top Beatle historian of the day, plugging his brand new book, Tune In. It's the first volume of this massive set he's doing. So it's going to be amazing. There's going to be something there for everyone. And it's also the 40-year anniversary of the Fest for Beatle Fans, which was started by Mark Lapidus back in 1974.
Robert, sounds like you're going to have a great time. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Thank you, Phil.
And you can visit our website for an excerpt from Robert Rodriguez's book, Revolver, about the making of the Beatles' revolutionary pop album. And back with some of your viewer feedback right after this.
Chicago Tonight is supported in part by the Joyce Foundation, dedicated to improving the quality of life in the Great Lakes region.